Having technical.
We're just trying to, I want to start with something a little more visual than my jacket, and I'll start talking, and if we get it going, we'll deal with it, and if we don't, I should have pointed this out earlier. So as Hillel said, and thank you for the introduction, I've been working, I think, for about 15 years specifically on the issue of the role of NGOs. It's come up in this conversation because in terms of the understanding of the conflict, in terms of the understanding of Palestinian society, Palestinian, what they call the right of return, the introduction of human rights and international law as a fundamental theme in the conflict. What we have is a combination of very strong NGO influence merged with and in many ways amplified by UNRWA and by UN organizations, and that's what I wanted to speak about. Okay. I'm going to start with this. Let's make it full size, and let's see if we can get him here.
Relief and Works Agency. All right, Chris. Brooke says it is documented. The State Department's aware. Canada's divested. Congressional lawmakers are aware. This is your chance to respond.
That's as loud as we get.
Well, can I say first of all that the Center for Near East Studies, or the center run by a man called David Begin, is so discredited that when he gave a briefing in Congress, which I attended,
David, you have the right of
no one
reply
attended.
here.
The man has no credibility. He has made accusations against UNRWA for years which are completely unfounded. Let me just take out this from my ear because the sound is coming back. Can I say that what David Begin does...
Okay. Those of you, David Begin is sitting in the audience. We should give him the right of reply, but that wasn't my purpose for this introduction. How many of you recognize the individual that is making these accusations? If you don't recognize him, then I'm going to tell you his name is Chris Gunness, and he is the face of UNRWA. He is the spokesperson and the advocacy director of UNRWA. Why should a UN organization, supposedly with a humanitarian aid agenda, have a spokesperson who makes allegations and accusations like this? What is the role that he has, and how does that reflect on the broader set of issues that UNRWA is supposed to deal with? Where do I go back to this now? Here it is. Okay, I got it. Here's another example, which I won't have time to show now, F5, which I can't do from here. Where do I hit this? From the beginning? Okay, so we'll just move it along here. No, this doesn't work the way it's supposed to. How do you go to the next one here? Next, okay. You can also find on YouTube, and actually this is what I had thought I was going to be showing you, was a scene that Chris Gunness starred in the middle of the 2014 Gaza war, in which he cried on television for the suffering of Palestinian children. What is happening in Gaza, particularly to the children, is an affront to humanity of all of us. Many people around the world, I would say that anybody who knows anything about UNRWA and is not part of the UN and political establishment in the West knows about UNRWA from its spokesperson's appearances on radio and television and the media as one of the most prominent advocates of the Palestinian cause, of the Palestinian narrative. In many ways, there are many aspects to UNRWA, but this is a very damaging part of it. This is the way in which UNRWA, and it's not about Chris Gunness only, it's not only about this individual, but the spokesperson, the advocacy element in UNRWA's activities adds to and fuels the conflict in many different ways. This is Chris Gunness appearing 2.5 weeks ago. I'm not sure you can read this. He spoke at an event that was organized as part of Palestinian Advocacy Month at Cambridge in the UK, at King's College. And he's in an event focusing on UNRWA and the Palestinian refugees, as it was called, from 1949. And the language that's used, I can't even read it from here, which refers to his work, talks about him as having, uses the term massacre to refer to Israeli responses to terrorism, and many other very much loaded words like that. And this is a very important part of UNRWA's activities. UNRWA has a large budget, period, but it also has a significant budget for advocacy, for supporting Palestine's path to independence, in quotes, for using human rights mechanisms to hold Israel accountable for its obligations under international law. In short, that's a term that's known as lawfare. UNRWA is a very major player in going to the International Criminal Court, in going to various international agencies, in the Human Rights Council and other parts of the United Nations, in making allegations against Israel that use the language. We see it sometimes in BDS, we see it in law firm, we see it in various other ways. This is a proposed budgetary framework, just to give you the scale that we're talking about, that the UN has put together for the period, for the next 4 years approximately.
How much is the budget?
The budget here is stated as $1.261 billion over 4 years. And I didn't go through the numbers, and I don't know how much of that is accounted for, how much of that is the requested budget. It's outside of my field. Maybe other people will know it here on the panel. But within that, you see $1.5 million for UNRWA specifically for this strategy, for these elements of its strategy. There are other UN agencies as well. You'll see a list here. I believe there are something like 17 UN agencies that are active, but UNRWA in the region, and many of them, I think there are 12 or 13, that have permanent staff in between, as I said, from the river to the sea, in Israel, the West Bank, Judea, Samaria, Gaza. UNRWA is by far the largest in terms of budget, in terms of employees, in terms of impact, and very much involved in this set of political activities. Just to give you some more quotes, because again, I don't want to make this solely about Chris Gunness. John Ging, who was the UNRWA director in Gaza until a few years ago, was an active supporter of the flotillas, and here's the language that he would talk about. Seeing ships coming in to the rescue. The sea is open. We've had a few human rights activists. This is about the Mavi Marmara, which some of you remember, in which a number of activists were killed, for which Israel was blamed again for war crimes, for deliberately killing humanitarian aid workers. And here we have the director of UNRWA in Gaza talking and completely embracing the myths, small boats coming to Gaza with medical supplies and other supplies. Again, why is UNRWA playing a major role? In the language he talks about the fourth year, illegal, inhumane, counterproductive blockade. This was going back to, I believe it was 2010. Flotilla to generate this new level of political clarity and resolve. The triumph over propaganda and legality over illegality. That's what he's talking about in respect to Israel. This is the head of UNRWA's activities, office, all of its structure in Gaza. I'm not sure whether Arnon Gross is going to talk about this or not. Hopefully they will, about the teachers and the role that they play in anti-Israel and often anti-Semitic propaganda. And there are a lot, and incitement to terrorism. Here's one, Hillel Neuer at the UN, and UN Watch has collected and published a lot of these. But here's another example of the way in which this process works. This is from one of the teachers, and you can see by the image this was posted on Facebook. It was subsequently taken down after there was the controversy. Here's Chris Gunness again, and you can go through his Twitter feed and you can see the role that he plays in this process. He's attacking UN Watch, which does important work in documenting the role of the United Nations, not only with respect to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but in other areas of politicization. And here he is going after UNRWA's enemies or his enemies. Again, a question of whether a professional who's heading the advocacy or spokesperson role in a UN agency has any business doing these sorts of things. I will skip some of the other illustrations. Here's, with respect, you can look at the images for a couple of seconds. Badil, which is the main Palestinian refugee NGO, which works very closely with UNRWA. And here you have some of the illustrations, which are, I don't have to use the term anti-Semitism for you to see what you see here. All these are part and parcel of the process. UNRWA is also a member, a very active participant. I talked about the role of UNRWA in lawfare, in using the instruments like the International Criminal Court, the UN Human Rights Council, and other frameworks to brand Israel as, and I'll be through in 2 more minutes or less, as guilty of war crimes. UNRWA is a major participant in what they call the UNICEF OPT, That's UN speak for occupied Palestinian territories. Somebody find me a map and tell me where those are exactly. Or sometimes they call themselves UNICEF Palestine. They're based in Beit Hanina, just outside Jerusalem. And they are active participants in a working group that UNICEF runs there, which is designed explicitly to categorize Israel in the UN Secretary General's annual report, the annex which lists countries and terror groups that are guilty of exploiting children under the framework of children in armed conflict reports. And UNRWA is a very active participant in trying to push Israel into that framework, the IDF in particular, because it comes with a batch of sanctions and other restrictions. In that framework, we have Sudan, we have groups like Boko Haram and Al-Qaeda and ISIS, and now they want to add Israel to this. And UNRWA is an active participant in this. And that's the point that I'm trying to make in all this. Now, I want to end by talking about ways in which there's an attempt being made to deal with this. I think it was Alex who mentioned, Alex or Asaf, for both of you, the Canadian government cut off its funding in 2010. It renewed it after the Liberals returned to power approximately a year and a half ago. But as part of that renewal of funding, they also established a framework, which is signed also by UNRWA, which sets up a set of guidelines for UNRWA's behavior. This is something that I believe is unprecedented. I know of no other parallel to this, in which they establish very specific requirements. And the word that comes out in reading those guidelines, and I won't, right now it's a few pages long, so I won't go through all the details, but in particular, the commitment to neutrality of staff and personnel. Now, the illustrations that I showed you, Chris Gunnis and others, are completely inconsistent with any normal meaning of the term neutrality. Furthermore, when and if those violations, those terms, those requirements, guidelines are violated, then there must be communication to staff about appropriate behavior in line with UNRWA's neutrality guidelines once a year in each of UNRWA's 5 fields of operation, and also reports to Palestinian Authority, to Egypt and to Israel, specifically on the implementation of these terms. It talks about specifically neutrality of facilities. Hey folks, the Canadians don't want you to put missiles and rockets in your schools to use against Israel for the next war, for whenever anybody feels like it. Things like that. That the requirement for neutrality is a very specific effort to change what has been taking place in UNRWA. Chris Gunnis has been there for 10 years. Other people have been there for longer. I want to end with some recommendations on this point. First of all, absolutely following all of UNRWA's activities in this field, and when those neutrality regulations, which are actually in part of UNRWA's own terms of reference, they are supposed to be neutral politically. When they violate these terms, to be called on them by the funding governments. Chris Gunnis in particular, he's been there for 10 years, he deserves his gold watch, if there's such a thing in the UNRWA framework. But as long as he continues there, UNRWA will be known for primarily for its advocacy activities. Advocacy not in a positive way, but for promoting the conflict. And I certainly would urge all the countries that provide funding to UNRWA, whether the United States resumes it or not, all the European countries that have pledged to fill in the gap from the United States withholding funds, to adopt the Canadian guidelines and hold UNRWA to those terms of reference. This will not solve all the problems, but it will certainly bring UNRWA into the framework for which it was supposed to have been acting back when it was established almost 70 years ago.